I mean, the big point for me really was not when it was becoming huge, it was when it was becoming little, right? The big point for me was not being alone and having 10, maybe 100 people being involved. That was a big point. Then everything else was very gradual. Going from 100 people to 1 million people is not a big deal. To me, well, I mean, maybe it is if you want to sell your result, it's a huge deal, don't get me wrong. But if you're interested in the technology and you're interested in the project, the big part was getting the community. Then the community grew gradually, and there's actually not a single point where I went like, wow, that just took off. Because it took a long time, relatively. So look at this. You can see on the walls are this light green. I'm told that at mental institutions they use that on the walls because it's like a calming color. It's not something that really stimulates you. What you can't see is the computer here. You only see the screen. But the main thing I worry about in my computer is it doesn't have to be big and powerful, although I like that. It really has to be completely. I know people who work for Google, and they have their own small data center at home, and I don't do that. My office is the most boring office you'll ever see, and I sit there alone, in the quiet. If the cat comes up, it sits in my lap, and I want to hear the cat purring, not the sound of the fans in the computer.
So this is astonishing, because working this way, you're able to run this vast technology empire. It is an empire. So that's an amazing testament to the power of open source. Tell us how you got to understand open source and how it led to the development of Linux.
I mean, I still work alone. I mean, I work alone in my house, often in my bathrobe. When a photographer shows up, I dress up, so I have clothes on. And that's how I've always worked. I mean, this was how I started Linux too. I did not start Linux as a collaborative project. I started it as one in a series of many projects I had done at the time for myself, partly because I needed the end result, but even more because I just enjoy programming. So it was about the end of the journey, which 25 years later we still have not reached, but it was really about the fact that I was looking for a project on my own, and there was no open source really on my radar at all. And what happened is the project grows and becomes something you want to show off to people, right? Really. And this is more of a, wow, look at what I did, and trust me, it was not that great back then. I made it publicly available, and it wasn't even open source at that point. At that point, it was source that was open, but there was no intention behind using the kind of open source methodology that we think of today to improve it. It was more like, look, I've been working on this for half a year. I'd love to have comments, right? And other people approached me. I had at the University of Helsinki, I had a friend who was one of the open source. It was called mainly free software back then. And he actually introduced me to the notion that, hey, you can use these open source licenses that had been around, and I thought about it for a while. I was actually worried about the whole commercial interests coming in. I mean, that's one of the worries I think most people who start out have, is that they worry about somebody taking advantage of their work, right? And I decided, what the hell, right?
Huh.
And
then at some point, someone contributed some code that you thought, wow, that really is interesting. I would not have thought of that. This could actually improve this.
It didn't even start by people contributing code. It was more that people started contributing ideas. And just the fact that somebody else takes a look at your project, and I'm sure it's true of other things too, but it's definitely true in code, is that somebody else takes an interest in your code, looks at it enough to actually give you feedback and give you ideas, that was a huge thing for me. I mean, so I was 21 at the time, so I was young, but I'd already programmed for half my life, basically. And every project before that had been completely personal, and it was a revelation when people just started commenting, started giving feedback on your code. And even before they started giving code back, that was, I think, one of the big moments where I said, I love other people. Right? Don't get me wrong, I'm actually not a people person, right? I am, right? I don't really love other people. But I love computers. I love interacting with other people on email because it kind of gives you that buffer. But I do love other people who comment and get involved in my project, and it made it so much more.
So was there a moment when you saw what was being built and it suddenly started taking off and you thought, wait a sec, this actually could be something huge, not just a personal project that I'm getting nice feedback on, but a kind of an explosive development in the whole technology world?
Not really. I mean, the big point for me really was not when it was becoming huge, it was when it was becoming little, right? The big point for me was not being alone and having 10, maybe 100 people being involved. That was a big point. Then everything else was very gradual. Going from 100 people to 1 million people is not a big deal. To me, well, I mean, maybe it is if you want to sell your result, it's a huge deal, don't get me wrong. But if you're interested in the technology and you're interested in the project, the big part was getting the community. Then the community grew gradually, and there's actually not a single point where I went like, wow, that just took off. Because it took a long time, relatively.
So all the technologists I talked to really credit you with massively changing their work. And it's not just Linux, it's this thing called Git, which is this management system for software development. Tell us briefly about that and your role in that.
So one of the issues we had, and this took a while to start to appear, is when you grow from having 10 people or 100 people working on a project to having 10,000 people, which, I mean, right now we're in the situation where just on the kernel we have 1,000 people involved in every single release, and that's every 2 months, roughly, 2 or 3 months. Some of those people don't do a lot, right? There's a lot of people who make small changes. But to